trust the sweetest rain. shall come with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. Jealous for me, his love's like a hurricane. I am a tree bending beneath the weight of his wind and mercy. And all of a sudden I am unaware of these afflictions eclipsed by glory, and I realize just how beautiful you are, how great your affections are for me. Oh, assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine, heir of salvation, purchase of God, born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, perfect delight, visions of rapture now burst on my sight. Angels descending, bring from above, echoes of mercy, whispers of love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Perfect submission, all is at rest. I in my Savior am happy and blessed, watching and waiting, looking of love, filled with His goodness, lost in His love. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. Praising my Savior all the day long.
Hello and welcome to another COVID-19 edition of South Jeff Christian Church online worship and teaching. I know that many of you are wondering when we might reopen the building for corporate worship and other events. And I understand the desire to be together. God designed human beings to be in community, and it's in community that we grow into Christ-like disciples. So our deacons have collected the relevant information in order to develop a plan that will lower the risk of infection when we're finally able to assemble. We have put an announcement on our website, but just to let you know, June the 14th will be our first Sunday back. So look at the website, look at our Facebook page, and listen to the phone tree for updates and other details. One of the many unfortunate consequences of the quarantine has been that those who were in the last year of their high school did not get to experience much of the last weeks of their senior year, like senior trips and proms and especially graduation and so forth. So last week, our student minister, John Thornsberry, had some signs and gift bags made to give to each of our 4 graduates. Our graduates this year, graduating from high school, are Mason Anderson, Madison Brown, Kelsey Kittle, and Caleb Utdyke. As he was delivering, John sent me a picture of it, and he had his superhero-themed face mask, and while he was making the deliveries, and I also noticed that he had clearly neglected his personal grooming during the quarantine. Somebody please buy that guy some beard conditioner. Thank you, John, for your creativity and taking the time to do that, and to Donna Cisco and Tressa Ward for assisting him in making our graduates feel valued at South Jeff. We really do appreciate it, and I'm sure they do too. So each week at this time, it's that we celebrate the Lord's Supper. If you haven't collected materials for that yet, please pause the video and do so right now. I was reminded this week of one of the more unusual communion moments in history. Astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were ready to step out of the lunar lander onto the surface of the moon. Aldrin radioed Earth saying, "Houston, this is Eagle. This is the lunar module pilot speaking. I would like to request a few moments of silence. I would like to invite each person listening in, whoever or wherever he or she may be, to contemplate for a moment the events of the last few hours, and also to give thanks in his own individual way to this accomplishment." What's not generally remembered is that during the moment of silence, Aldrin took out a small silver communion set that had been given to him by his pastor of the church he was an elder at. Taking the juice and the bread, he read from John chapter 15, verse 5, where Jesus said, "I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit, but apart from me, you can do nothing." Then he prayed, thanking God for the intelligence and spirit to land men on the moon. Now, to date, it's the only religious service of any kind held on the moon. The first liquid poured on the moon and the first food eaten on the moon were the same elements of which we'll take now. It's appropriate, isn't it? That Jesus is here, no matter where here is. Whether we're all together in this room, or we're at home, or even on the moon, there is no place that he isn't, and that his sacrifice didn't make a difference. I have something in my hand that's very special to me. This is a lock blade knife made by the Kershaw Knife Company. It's special for two reasons. One, it's made by the company founded by Pete Kershaw, and my mother's maiden name was Kershaw, so it has some connection of distant relation. Don't ask me how, because I'm not really sure. More importantly, it's also one of the first gifts that my wife ever gave me when we were married. Sometime in our first and second year, I don't remember exactly. I don't use it much now. Preachers don't have much call for a knife like this, but there was a time that I carried it and used it a lot. This knife, unfortunately, has a history of drawing a lot of blood, all of it mine. Kershaw blades, Kershaw knives, are a very high-quality knife. They can be made extremely sharp and can take a lot of use. But even the best knives will eventually need to be sharpened. It doesn't matter if you bought the Ginsu Thermonuclear 3000 on 3 a.m. at the Home Shopping Network. All knives, though, eventually grow dull, no matter where you got it, no matter how high quality it is. So when a valuable, useful, high-quality knife grows dull, what do? You throw it away? You put it in a drawer or buy another one? Of course not. Now, normally, one would expect to sharpen it, or at least have it sharpened. Losing an edge on a knife is normal, but leaving it that way is not normal. I think this has application for our spiritual lives. I don't care who you are, from a brand new, enthusiastic believer, passionate about your new life with Jesus, or if you're someone who's been in the faith for decades with years of wisdom and understanding from walking with Christ. We all grow spiritually dull. We lose our edge in certain areas of life. Could be marriage, could be parenting, could be applying our faith in our workplace, could be an issue with our character. Could be something about our ministry. We've just reached a lid there. It could be relationships. We all get dull. Listen, losing our edge is a normal part of life. Life can wear us down. It's not a reflection of our status of saved persons. I want to make sure you understand that. We're saved by the grace of God through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's his work that saved us, and it's his work that keeps us saved. What's not normal is staying dull. God's provided ways in which we can regain our spiritual edges and stay sharp. For example, Jesus' half-brother James writes that our trials and temptations have a way of sharpening our trust and our endurance. That's why we can, as he says, count it all joy when we have various trials. Trials and temptations come to us uninvited, but God can and does use them to make us more like Christ. But one of the main ways he uses to help us become sharp and stay sharp is given to us by Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. He wrote in Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. It's one person, a leader, helping another person or another leader become better. Among the church, we sometimes call this discipling, or more recently we call it mentoring or coaching, but no matter what we call it, it's a principle that's found throughout Scripture. I'm going to list a few of them for you. For example, Moses, who's considered the greatest prophet besides Jesus, was mentored by his father-in-law Jethro. Moses then turned and mentored Joshua. The priest Eli mentored Samuel, then Samuel mentored two of Israel's kings, Saul, then more successfully with David. Elijah mentored Elisha. Daniel mentored Nebuchadnezzar, and very likely a class of astrologers and astronomers called the Magi, who we know came looking for the king of the Jews centuries after Daniel. Paul also mentioned two younger protégés of his named Timothy and Titus. Timothy discipled Epaphras. Of course, the most famous example is the master leader, Jesus, teaching, leading, coaching, and sharpening 12 apostles who in turn had disciples of their own. Now, in each of those examples, leaders had people in their lives who acted as a sharpening stone in some sense. So how does one do this for another? Just a few verses before Proverbs chapter 27, verse 17 is Proverbs chapter 27, verse 6, and it mentions one way. It says, "Wounds from a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." Now, normally, we only think of friends as those who we get along with, whom we trust not to hurt us. And if they point out some weakness or flaw or ultimate blind spot, we might get offended and angry and put some distance in the relationships. But C.S. Lewis has a different way of looking at it. He says, he uses the metaphor of rats in the cellar to illustrate our reflex. He says, we may not see the rats or even know they're there, but you open the door quietly and turn on the light, and what happens? You see the rats and they scurry away. Lewis says that when a friend wounds us with criticism or points out something we need to work on, we often blame the light instead of being thankful for being shown the rats. See, you can't eliminate what you can't see. And when you see it, we should be thankful for the light. Now, if we pair Proverbs chapter 27, verse 6 with 27:17, wounds from a friend, that becomes the iron upon which we're sharpened. I can think of some notable experiences in the Bible. For example, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we find the story of how David, king of Israel, lusted for the wife of Uriah, who was an important member of the royal bodyguard. They slept together, she got pregnant, then David arranged to have Uriah killed in battle, then took her as his own wife to cover up the whole affair. It's a very famous biblical story. Now understand, this is normal behavior for the pagan kings of that era that were all around David. See something you want? Take it for yourself, even if you have to kill somebody and no one dares mention it. But David is not the king of a normal people. They are God's people through whom the Messiah would come into the world. So a scandalous sin of a leader cannot go without confrontation. The integrity of the nation is at stake, so God can't just let the matter drop. So what's he do? He sends the prophet Nathan. Nathan doesn't just jump right in and confront David and ask him who he thinks he is to take another man's wife. Instead, he tells him a parable about a poor citizen who had only one lamb, and that man loved that lamb very, very much. It was a member of the family. It was a pet. A wealthier citizen, though, with many, many sheep, had a guest come to town, and instead of killing one of his own sheep for supper, he took the poor man's one lamb, killed it, cooked it, ate it. David was incensed at the story, and he wanted the rich man severely punished. Well, that's when Nathan pulls out the real reason for his visit. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7, Nathan says to Daniel, "You are the man." Now, reading between the lines, it's plausible that David had begun to resemble the pagan kings and assume no one was the wiser. And even if they were, who's going to say something to the king? Nobody's going to talk to him about his face. Nobody's going to confront him about it. So he had, in essence, gotten away with it and likely would have just gone on doing king stuff. We assume this because it's not until Nathan, at God's direction, confronts David and he wounds David. It's conceivable that David's conscience was so calloused by this time that he would have ignored the issue until Nathan gashed him. So at that point, David's eyes are open to his sin, and he immediately repents. Leanne and I watch a veterinarian show called The Incredible Dr. Pol. I think I mentioned it before. People will bring in their pets which have been in a fight or they've cut themselves or been hit by a car, etc. And they often need stitches. So they bring it in to get it fixed, but sometimes they've waited too long to bring them in. So what happens is their injuries have begun to heal themselves, but they're not healing right and will never heal right. And they'll cause some long-term issues. So what Paul has to do is scrape the old injury with a scalpel till it bleeds again and create new edges that can be then overlapped and stitched together, and then it can heal properly. I think that's a picture of what happens when a wound from a friend, when a mentor or coach or discipler or whatever you want to call it steps in and scrapes something in our lives, we assume that it's okay or we never even considered it, and it stings. It's painful to be reminded of sin or have a weakness exposed or to realize that we're not all we thought we were in the first place. That hurts. Our first instinct then is to get defensive. Think about the time somebody's pointed out a blind spot in your life. What was your initial reaction to that? Did you blame the light bearer? Did you get angry? Did you stop listening? If we do that, then we miss out on an opportunity for growth. At the other end of the spectrum from King David was his predecessor, King Saul. One of the most powerful prophets in the Bible was a prophet named Samuel, who had lived during the time of King Saul and King David. And he spoke to both of them often. Now, one would think that Samuel would be a pretty good mentor, a direct line to God. On one occasion, Saul was told by the prophet Samuel to wait for him before he offered a sacrifice previously to going into battle. Now, Samuel didn't come as soon as Saul thought he should, so he offered the sacrifice himself. About that time, Samuel shows up. Now, instead of admitting that he blew it, Saul begins to justify himself. He blames Samuel for being late. He blamed his own soldiers for getting restless and fearful. And he claims, he said, I was only seeking the Lord's direction. As a result of his disobedience, the Lord took Saul's throne away from him and his household and gave it to David. What a difference it would have made, I think, if Saul had just listened to the voice of Samuel speaking into his life, accepted the rebuke, and like David, repented. As I reflect on why, like Saul, I'm hesitant, even resistant. I'm like Saul. I hate to take responsibility and accept discipling. I think it's rooted in fear as I think about it. I'm afraid of being wrong. I'm afraid of being perceived as weak. I'm afraid of it being used against me. I'm afraid the other person doesn't really have my best interest at heart and only wants to embarrass me. I'm afraid about how I look to others and on and on. So I just try to justify myself. There's a certain amount of suffering that comes with even needing to be coached and redirected. It would help, though, if I could just remember these three things. I think they'll be helpful to you. Number one, Jesus has already justified me by his resurrection, so there's no need for me to justify myself. I can't justify myself. The very fact of not measuring up acknowledges what we already know to be true. I'm broken by sin. The energy we put into trying to convince others and ourselves that we're better than we are is just simply wasted. Jesus has already done the work, and he grants us grace. Number two, Jesus is for us. He's not against us. As I mentioned, there's a certain amount of anxiousness that comes with admitting we can't do something and need help. We think about how will that be perceived? What will people think? Will I lose credibility? And will they take away my ability to lead? Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 through 7, in the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders, all of you. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because we all have things that need to get better. He says, because God oppresses the proud, but shows favor to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. Now, some commentators think verse 7, cast your anxiety on him, is a new thought, new paragraph, but I don't really think it is. I think God understands the vulnerability that comes with submission and being clothed with humility. So he reassures us we can do it because he cares for us. Years ago, as a staff member of another church, I was really floundering. I just wasn't doing well at all. I didn't understand what was expected of me. I didn't understand what a good job looked like. I didn't know what to do or how to do it. The senior minister and I had already had several meetings, and they didn't go well. I was trying to figure all this out, and it was just anxious to me all the time. I really didn't know if I was going to be able to keep my job. So before yet another meeting, I decided that I would stop justifying myself and pretending to know what I was doing and just admit I didn't know. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to do it. Didn't know what was expected. So I just laid it all out. I'll admit I was scared. I was anxious. I mean, they thought I could do the job and hired me for that, and it turns out I couldn't. And it was humiliating. But I went to the meeting, and I just decided I'm just going to get it out there, and I'm going to say it. And instead of instant firing, the leader said, well, Why don't we just meet each Monday for a month and sketch out some goals and a ministry plan? That's what we did. And using that mentoring, I stayed at that place for almost 9 years with ever-increasing responsibilities. I still use those principles that I learned today. It was a humbling season. And Jesus took care of my anxieties just like he promised. I really wish I was always that trusting. The third thing we might remember when somebody wounds us or flips the light on in our cellar and we see the rats, we all have something to learn. We all have something to teach. Whether it be parenting, marriage, money management, work life, especially spiritually, we're all at different points on a continuum and in need of sharpening to some degree. In every stage of life, there is someone that's ahead of us that can give us an edge, and there's somebody behind us for whom you can serve as a sharpener. Remembering that taking instruction easier. When I remember, it kind of smooths the path. See, Jesus designed his church to function best in community. We need each other to grow because we're at different places in our walk with Christ. And without mentoring, discipling, coaching, accountability to each other, we're doomed to keep repeating sins and repeating mistakes and being limited in the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit. So in a sense, we should welcome and even seek people to be in our lives. Later in his life, David wrote these words in Psalm chapter 141, verse 5. Be a good memory verse, I think. It says, "Let a righteous man strike me, that is a kindness. Let him rebuke me, and it's oil on my head." I wonder if when he was writing that, he had in mind Nathan's rebuke. And while the consequences of his actions didn't change, and they were painful, they were costly, he realized what a favor the Lord had done for him through Nathan. Don't wait for the Lord to take the initiative to rebuke you and wound you. Instead, seek out discipline through Christian mentor. I want to finish this message with some very practical steps for seeking someone to disciple you. There's 4 of them, and so just if you got a piece of paper, write them down. Number 1, clearly define what you need and where you need sharpening. There will not be any one person who can guide you in every area. No perfect mentor, just one who can help in that area. So be clear what you're looking for. Parenting, marriage, work, money, character. Be precise. Probably need multiple people because Jesus is the only complete person. Number 2, do a low-cost request. Don't ask for once a week for 12 months. Instead, ask for 30 minutes one time. If it goes well, then ask for another, and then maybe you can get a relationship built. Number 3, prepare questions in advance, maybe 3 or 4, and own the agenda. Know what you want to know, then ask. The more specific, the better. To get that person in advance the question to maximize the time. Now lastly, during the meeting, shut up. You're there to learn. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 5 says, "Let the wise listen and they will add to their learning. Let the discerning get guidance." I'm going to put a link for a PDF of those 4 steps so you can retrieve them easily and hopefully implement them yourself. It's difficult to admit that we're unable to help ourselves, but ultimately that's the core of the gospel. We have to admit that we're sinners. We're broken, we're helpless, we're dead in our transgressions. To be saved, we have to trust somebody else, somebody mentor us or go along with us to point us back to the Father. And when we humble ourselves into his saving hand, what's he do? He lifts us up. That might be you today. If you're ready to trust Jesus and be baptized, then let me know by calling the church or emailing me at brett.baker@mysouthjeff.org. That's brett.baker@mysouthjeff.org. Let me pray over you. Lord, it's difficult to put our future in somebody else's hands. To understand that we are lacking, that we have a hole inside of us, that we have something missing or that we're weak, we have a character flaw, we don't know something about a job that we're supposed to know about, and we turn to somebody else, and that is so humbling. But often, Lord, it's you who have put that person in our place so we can humble ourselves and be lifted up by you. I pray that somebody today would realize they need to be mentored back to the Lord, that they will turn to Jesus and they will ask him for forgiveness of their sins so that he can fill up that spiritual hole that's inside of them and quench every thirst and feed every hunger. In Jesus' name, amen.